Hey, welcome everybody. Good evening, wherever you're at on this flat motionless plane. My name is Noel Joshua Hadley. This is the Unexpected Cosmology, and I am here with my friends Chuck and John Q. And of course, John Q is the author of the book Q and the Millennial Kingdom, which we sell here at the Unexpected Cosmology. He's been on with me several times now. And Chuck, this is, I think, your third or fourth time coming in with us. And we are talking tonight about the seven heavens of Narnia, or you call it the seven firmaments of heaven. Of course, I think the title is Gods of Narnia. And one of the things I've been wanting to do here at the Unexpected Cosmology over the last few months is get back to my roots and talk about just biblical cosmology. And been covering it a lot. And there was maybe 3 months ago or so, John Q, he sends me this article on a book that came out several years back called Planet Narnia. I'd never heard of it before. And it was this phenomenal review of the book, talking about how the medieval cosmology plays into the Chronicles of Narnia. And so we want to cover that tonight. And it was so good. I've been wanting to work it into some of my, like some sort of video or something. And so John Q, he comes out to visit me 3 weeks ago now, was it, John Q? I've lost track of the time. And we had a great time. We hung out for a few days, and we got to go see the new Tolkien War of the Rohirrim, the Lord of the Rings movie, which was perfect because we're both Tolkien fans. And so we got to go see that together. So what are you guys looking at right here? I want to cover a few things before we get too deep in this discussion tonight, just so nobody is lost. First and foremost, let me just scroll back here. This right here is a picture. It's kind of so big I have to scroll through it. This is a picture of Hebrew cosmology, and I've been covering a lot of this here at the Unexpected Cosmology. So obviously the Bible teaches the earth as a motionless flat plane, the solid firmament above, heaven directly above the firmament. And you see the waters above right there, and the sun and the moon inside the firmament, and then there's the great deep and the foundations and the pillars and all that kind of stuff. There's a few different models here to look at. And of course, you see that all the ancients all over the world, except for modern NASA imagery, of course, that's not a real photograph, but modern NASA imagery, well, show something different. But anyways, so what I really want to focus on though right here is actually this one's a good one here, because even though it shows a globe Earth here, you see this individual trying to figure out what first, second, and third heaven is. And so he doesn't show the firmament as a solid crystalline piece, but what he was trying to figure out is where space goes and the planets and that kind of thing. And this is where, when we get into books like the Ascension of Isaiah or the Apocalypse of Abraham, Second Enoch, there's a few of them. I'm going to forget some of them. They talk about the mystery of the seven within the three. And let me just show you this here from the Chronicles of Jeremiah. And this is a medieval text. And it says the firmament is divided into 7 degrees, one above the other. There are 7 distinct places for these 7 planets, and then he gives their order. So this is the order he gives here, and this comes from a probably late Middle Ages. I think it's a wood cutting originally, and of course you see the Earth here is a plane. And I'm still a little confused on what this is right here. Like, is that, like, it looks like fire to me. I'm not really sure, but the first comes, we have the moon, the Luna. It's a very sad looking, I think we just cut out there. Hopefully my audio is okay. It looks like a very sad looking Luna, and I could talk a little bit about why that is. And then we got a couple planets here, Mercury and Venus. And then we have the sun. So that would be 1, 2, 3, 4. And then we have 3 above, and that would be Jupiter, Saturn, and Mars, respectively. So, and then right up here is the very top. This is all the other stars, and then this would be the solid firmament. And then right here you have the saints in heaven, the angels, and so on and so forth. And the idea is what we're going to be looking at tonight through Lewis's ideas of the Chronicles of Narnia and the Space Trilogy, is that each of these planets are a world into themselves. It's a different layer. It's literally a different world. You don't really want to think of it in a context of like a planet you can visit, but it's within these different layers within the firmament. So we have a lot to cover tonight, but let me just do this. I'm skipping some of this here. All right. Let's talk really quickly about C.S. Lewis and the Space Trilogy. And, one of the things that Lewis did was he kind of reminds me a little bit of Hal Lindsey. I was talking to you guys, Chuck and John Q, about this beforehand, is that however anyone feels about, dispensationalism or eschatology, I'm certainly not a dispensationalist by any means, and neither are you guys. But when he came along, Hal Lindsey, in the late 60s, early 70s, he was a guy who started getting the laymen, the typical people within the church all across the board to start getting excited about talking about eschatology and biblical prophecy. Well, this is what C.S. Lewis essentially did to the laymen back in the 40s and 50s. And I think it was Mere Christianity, and that came through a series of radio broadcasts right around the Second World War. And he was the individual who started getting kind of pulling theology, dry theology, away from the priest and the clergy, and giving it into the laps of the people in the pews, and getting them to be able to talk about theological concepts very simply. But the brilliance of Lewis is that he was way more complex of an individual that people give him credit for. And I'll give you guys an example. Of course, we were talking about this beforehand, and I've been to the Eagle and Child in Oxford, where he and Tolkien met, and they read through, for the first time, the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings and the Narnia books and all this kind of stuff. And Tolkien apparently was unable to finish the Chronicles of Narnia. He just thought it was just, I don't know if you call it garbage, but it was just, for him, it was just gibberish. Like, it was like, how in the world do you get a talking beaver and Greek centaurs and fauns and like British German dwarfs with these children from England, and it's just, it's all this stuff kind of mashed together. And he's like, I can't make any sense of this, right? But one of the things I think we're going to be showing tonight is, agree with his theology or not, he embedded this brilliant, deep thought into his books that he didn't even tell me. He went to his deathbed and he's like, well, maybe someday people are going to figure it out. So really quickly here, this is the Space Trilogy. This is called The Field of Arbol. And not that there's going to be a test on this. I'm not expecting anyone to memorize this. But what he did is he took the different planets, the wandering stars, and he gave them these names. And get a little Tolkien on you guys here. He talks about I'm going to mispronounce this, the Oerusu. He says that there's, in each of these worlds, that there are rulers. There's these gods that are rulers over each of these worlds. Now, what came to my attention with this is when we went through the ascension of Isaiah, and Isaiah is going through each of these different 7 heavens. He talked about how there is an emperor, an angel that is the ruler over that entire world, but that, as you ascend up, each of the rulers get more powerful above the others. There's this hierarchy going up. So if you were if you're the ruler of the lowest heaven, you're in a small pond compared to the rest. And so this is from Paralandra, chapter 16. This would be, I think, the second one in the Space Trilogy. This is what we read. We think that when creatures of the hypersomatic kind choose to appear to us, they are not, in fact, affecting our retina at all, but directly manipulating the relevant parts of our brain. If so, it is quite possible that they can produce there the sensations we should have if our eyes were capable of receiving those colors in the spectrum which are actually beyond their range. I had a reason for putting that in there. But these are, it says here, this is coming off the actual article. It says that they're people, or angels, set to guard a world, and each planet in the field of Arbol, as C.S. Lewis calls it, has its own ruler, its own god, and they communicate to one another in a language that he calls Old Solar, the original language. So each of these is appointed as the spiritual leader of their inhabited world, and it is their job to monitor the spiritual evolution of the races and ensure that they do not succumb to the influence of evil. Each one of these is allowed to guide each world and its moons as they see fit, allowing various worlds to develop different cultures that match their spiritual rulers' philosophies. Now, again, what's important to, well, let me just read to the end of this. Once one of them turns to the dark side, the world is quarantined by the Ildala until they are defeated, and their influence is eradicated, and fallen worlds usually end up becoming major battlegrounds. They are only seen occasionally, and the main character, Ransom, perceives as shimmering light. Okay, that's enough on that. I don't need to read all this. Okay. All right, so we're going to be covering Planet Narnia, the Seven Heavens in the Imagination of C.S. Lewis. And let's just go through the introduction here in this article. And as I do this, I'm going to be bringing Chuck and John Q in to make any comment they want. And we're going to hopefully get through all 7 books tonight because there's a lot to cover. Around 2008 or 2009, Michael Ward, now he is the author of this book, Planet Narnia, gave a presentation of Planet Narnia at Hillsdale College. I may or may not have attended. I can't remember for certain. And then he gave a presentation of Planet Narnia at New St. Andrews College in 2015, which I did attend and do remember vividly. And in 2022, I finally got around to reading the book. The presentations were great, but the book is phenomenal. Just an incredible work. Slam dunk, home run, maximally persuasive, highly recommended. Now, what we'll be showing you tonight is that really, I think, for the first time in 70 years, 80 years, it's probably been 80 years now since the Chronicles of Narnia have been published, because we're looking at the mid-50s. It seems like Michael Ward's the guy who figured it out. And I specifically started saying that, Tolkien was like, he couldn't even finish them. And it seems like his idea of what the Chronicles were kind of became the mainstream thought. And Lewis was one of those guys who was just, so brilliant. And he could have dissected his own work for people, and he chose not to. And, that's what a lot of, writers and artists choose not to do. In Planet Narnia, Ward argues that C.S. Lewis infused each book of the Narnian Chronicles with an atmosphere, or as he calls it, a donegality of the medieval cosmos. And I already showed you guys the illustration of medieval cosmology. And that's it. That each of the 7 heavens of the medieval conception corresponds to each of the chronicles. In the medieval world, the 7 heavens, or 7 planets, were associated with different ancient gods. These gods each had different qualities to them, which appear in the corresponding chronicle. And each of these qualities are often shown as different aspects of Aslan. If Augustine, I should say, baptized Plato, and Thomas Aquinas baptized Aristotle, then I think we might say Lewis baptized the gods. Now, there's going to be some reservations out there when I read something like that to you. And I just do want to remind everybody that I'm presenting this. It's up for you guys to decide. But I hope that we could, agree or not with Lewis's theology. I hope that we can make a good kind of understanding of what he was actually trying to get at. Now, I've recently been reading St. Justin Martyr's Apologies, and St. Justin tells us that the pagan gods came from demons. These demons heard various prophecies of Christ from the prophets, like Moses and Isaiah. Then the demons provided these various imitations of fulfilled messianic prophecies, which were the various pagan gods. Now, I have a slightly different point of view on this, and I'm more akin to say that the Watchers from the Book of Enoch, they created the mystery religions, and that they actually brought the mysteries of heaven down with them. And this is why we see across the board, we see these we talk a lot about how we see commonalities in architecture, like the cathedrals all over the world, and they're all the same on all the different continents. It's the same thing with the different religions. We see a lot of commonalities within them because they derive from the same mysteries of heaven. And of course, we can get into Psalm 82, where Elohim or Allahayam speaks to these 70 gods who rule over the earth, and he chastises them for not teaching instructions in righteous living. They are disseminating the mysteries, but and the mysteries of heaven are true mysteries, but that doesn't mean that they are being righteous. Those are two different things. So anyways, I digress. So the fallen angels were trying to rob God of his glory by creating these false imitations of Christ. Now, already I'm going to have a different opinion than this writer, the guy writing the article, not the book, because obviously I don't believe fallen angels and demons are classified as the same. A lot of you know what I'm talking about. I would argue Lewis is stealing these imitations and giving the glory back to Christ. If the demons were trying to lead people away from Christ with these myths, Lewis is trying to lead people to Christ with them. Planet Narnia is remarkable for many reasons. One is that no one ever noticed Lewis was doing this, which is true. Yet Michael Ward makes a very compelling case. He gives us a mountain of evidence to demonstrate that this was in fact intentional on Lewis's part. Ward does this by giving us evidence from Lewis's other works, including his poetry, his personal letters, and his other fictional series, the Ransom Trilogy. Essentially, he calls it the Ransom Trilogy because I always hear it called the Space Trilogy, but that's what he's talking about there, the Ransom Trilogy. For example, and to be fair, C.S. Lewis, I think he never called it the Space Trilogy. I think that's from the publishers. For example, in Lewis's essay on the alliterative meter, he says, the characters of the planets, as conceived by medieval astrology, seem to me to have a permanent value as spiritual symbols. That's from Lewis. Ward shows us how the characters of the planet show up as spiritual symbols in the Narniad. The Narniad. If you want to know how they correspond, you need to read the book. But I will briefly attempt to summarize or give scattered glimpses of the spiritual symbols of each heaven and the corresponding book where we experience them incognito. Now, as a reminder, the seven heavens are Luna, Mercury, Venus, Sol, a Sol would be the sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. All right, so I'm going to hand it over to you guys really quickly for comment, and let's get a discussion going. John Q, Chuck, who wants to talk first?
Chuck, you okay if I go first, or?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll wrap up the first section if you want to go first.
Yeah, so I think it'd be helpful for the audience if we know a little bit of background about the author of Planet Narnia, Michael Ward. He's a professor of apologetics at Houston Christian University. He's a visiting professor at Hillsdale College and a teacher associate member of the faculty of theology and religion at Oxford University. He's been a big fan of Lewis for most of his life. He's dedicated, I would say, much of his time trying to understand the symbolism behind Lewis's work, as well as others in Lewis's sphere of influence, such as Tolkien or G.K. Chesterton. That crowd of really great minds that were running around together in the early 1900s or early to mid 1900s. His PhD was on the theological imagination of C.S. Lewis, and he was actually the warden of the C.S. Lewis House in Oxford for 3 years in the 90s. So he was kind of the caretaker of that for a little bit. So he's really, I would say, really become a subject matter expert on C.S. Lewis. And so one of the things you talked about, Noel, about how Lewis wouldn't call it Space Trilogy, never did. And I was watching an interview with Ward, and he brought that up as well. He made the point that Planet Narnia is all about the C.S. Lewis's sort of engagement with the medieval cosmology. But the most glaring use of medieval cosmology, he would say, was the what his publishers called the Space Trilogy, but what he said we really should call it the Ransom Trilogy. He said that quote that he would find you to be a person non grata, banished to the outer darkness if you called it the Space Trilogy. I thought that was a funny quote there. Sort of the reason that, and this is what he said about the Space Trilogy, the reason that you shouldn't call it the Space Trilogy is that the main character, we mentioned his name, Ransom, when he's going to Mars, he's amazed by the radiance and the brilliance around him. He says, "This isn't space. Space is like an empty blackness, right?" He says, "Space is a blasphemous libel for this empire of ocean of radiance in which he finds himself in." He goes on to say that space is the wrong word. And then later at the end of the novel, I think this was the first novel, first one. Ransom says that if we could affect the change in just 10% of the readers of this book, from using the word space to using the word heavens, we would have made a start. So the whole point of the Ransom trilogy, Michael Ward says, was to push back against that notion of the cosmos, the notion of space, empty space, darkness, and like as you said, Lewis never used that description and really never would have.
It's good. Chuck, did you have anything you want to throw in here?
Yeah. So my brain wanders a little differently than you guys' does. When I saw the seven heavens, and we're going to get into a lot more detail on this stuff as we go through each one of the seven heavens, but I thought it interesting that when you put them in an order, the order that he put them in here, the different gods and what they stood for, Jupiter being a jovial or a joyous god, Mars being a warrior, Sol being light or the unconquered sun, Luna being self-sustaining or a servant, Mercury is duality and relational duality, Venus being love, humor, and beauty, and Saturn being death, disaster, or the sword. When you put all those together, it just reminded me of Revelation 5:6. And that is, "And I beheld, and lo, in the midst of the throne and of the four beasts," which those four beasts were a lion, a man, an ox, and an eagle, "in the midst of the elders stood a lamb as it had been slain, having 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God sent forth into all the earth." It just struck me that each one of those is considered to be a deity. And we're told in scripture that there are 7 spirits of God that all represent the lamb that was slain, which C.S. Lewis relates back to being Aslan. Like, they're all different aspects of Aslan that are represented in all the books, which Aslan is, from what I've ever been told, is a representation of Christ in the books, which Revelation seems to agree with. And I just didn't find it coincidence that there's 7 books, 7 heavens, 7 days, 7 spirits, and 7 heavenly bodies. It doesn't strike me as being a coincidence there. And the 7 spirits all seem to represent aspects that Yah tells us about himself. And also he claims to have 7 spirits that he embodies. It just doesn't seem coincidental to me that all of those things line up. Like, just where my brain went with it from that aspect. And I just thought that was really cool. So.
No, that is. And so, and what you had mentioned there about, Messiah having these 7 spirits. So those of you out there watching or listening to this, you're going to see what he's talking about as we go through this, and how Lewis has Aslan embody each of these different gods. Now, let me just say from a different perspective here, because generally when you have these discussions, you're going to have people jumping in and say, well, this is all pagan, right? This is all pagan. And one of my good friends, Paulie Hart, he wrote a short story that really got me excited recently. It was about a year ago he wrote it. And it just quickly, it's a story of this guy. He dies, he goes to heaven, but he was never really very virtuous in life. Like, he wasn't really being obedient to the commands. And he learns that when you get to heaven, there's these several different worlds that you go to. And to go to the highest is for those who are the most obedient and closest to Yah in that way. But he doesn't go there. And he finds that he is in this world that is ruled over by a feminine goddess. And I can't remember who it was. It wasn't Venus, but it was one of those. And he's shocked. He's like, I thought you were a pagan goddess. Like, how in the world are you ruling over heaven? And she explains to him, she says, well, none of that is true. Actually, I've always been obedient to the Most High. I've been very faithful, and I tried to instruct humanity. I tried my best, but humanity wouldn't have it. And they basically corrupted my image, and they formed me into something that I wasn't. So at the end of the day, when we're talking about these 70 Elohim that were instructed to rule over humanity, how many of these gods, I've asked this question many times. How many of these gods repented? How many of them were truly evil? How many of them were good but misrepresented? And I've also talked a lot about, you mentioned the seven spirits, Chuck, but one of them is Hakamaka, or Hakamaha, who is wisdom, or in the Greek, Sophia. And one of the seven planets we'll be talking tonight about is Venus. And Venus, I have pointed out many times, in my opinion, is the corrupted version of wisdom, of Sophia, of Hakamaha, one of the seven spirits of Allah-Hayam. And so what Lewis is going to be showing, I think, he's going to be showing a lot of duality. He's going to be showing, okay, so there's true versions of these gods, but then there's also perverse versions of these gods. So with let's go ahead and get into this. Unless, John Q, you want to jump in and say something else.
Yeah, just real quick on Lewis. Something for people who aren't familiar with Lewis's work, if you haven't read it, or maybe you've heard that it's, he used a lot of pagan symbolism or anything. Lewis is a genius when it comes to symbolism, and you need to really understand that his symbolism is really meant to be enjoyed, not contemplated. And he does this on purpose, because I think he really had a good understanding, a true understanding of what it really means to know God, right? We can study God from an external point of view, right, through religious studies or examining the Bible or historical documents, that kind of thing. But that would just be looking at him or at Christianity per se. But it wouldn't be what it really means to know him. Okay, so and the way he wrote, he really kind of embraces the understanding that to truly know God is through that personal relationship, the element of faith, and that's kind of how he weaves the symbolism into the story. And because, for example, Mrs. Beaver in the Chronicles of Narnia, she has a sewing machine, and when you're reading that as a reader, most people don't even think, well, why does you ask the question, why does she have a sewing machine? It's just accepted that she has a sewing machine, even though a sewing machine is, not at all, something that you would expect there. Narnia is not a industrialized society. The sewing machine is a product of industrialization, but it's just sort of there. And the way he writes and immerses you in the story and the atmosphere of the story, you don't even question it. You don't even think about it, really. So it's just those kind of things that once you see that about Lewis, you really begin to appreciate his work.
If I could add one more
Let
thing.
me just comment on the. Please, Chuck. Please do.
It just strikes me as it strikes me as programming when we have this knee-jerk reaction to looking at things that involve symbolism or pagan symbolism, or what we would consider to be pagan symbolism. One of the reasons why I'm not offended by Lewis's use of it is because I don't see the symbolism as being purely pagan. Like, the pagans stole that symbolism from somebody. They didn't create it. Like, these beings were there. They either knew them or interacted or knew of them in some way, shape, or form relationally. It wasn't a surprise to them. Like, they just wrote about the things that they did and saw. And it's all perspective. If these people didn't know the way that these beings worked in cosmological society, if for lack of a better term, of course they're going to see them as a deity and start worshiping them. That, like you said previously, Noel, that didn't have anything to do with the deity itself, as Paulie pointed out. It had everything to do with their perspective of that deity. So they worshiped the aspects of them that they saw instead of giving praise to the one that sent them. So this knee-jerk reaction to just hating everything pagan, or like, oh, that's pagan symbology. It isn't. It's the true symbology of what the thing was, and it's all the perspective that the person that you're reading or assigning it to had. Like that's all it is. It's just a different perspective on the same things. If you get your perspective and your source of truth from the one source of truth, it all falls in line. Like you give glory to where it's supposed to be, and the other things just are what they are.
Yeah,
So,
and Lewis himself really was one thing he said in I think it might have been, I don't remember which book it was. It might have been his autobiography. But he said, I used to think the world is a hodgepodge, that the universe was empty space. It was hollow and meaningless and bleak without design. But when I became a Christian, I had a 180-degree conversion on that point. The universe hadn't changed, but my perspective on it had changed utterly. And you can see that perspective change in his writing. Like, with that understanding, if maybe you're dismissing Narnia, like think again. When you look more closely, you'll see that, C.S. Lewis designed Narnia with just the utmost attention to detail. But you kind of have to be in the right frequency to see it.
Yeah, I was going to mention the. I don't want to comment on one comment that was put in here, but in terms of paganism, and this has taken me years to appreciate this or understand, what happened with the Watchers, and I talk about this a lot. And you see something like Azazel. Like right now, everyone can see I'm wearing a red shirt. All right, hopefully it comes out on the camera red. This has a dye to it, right? And I wear a lot of wool shirts with dyes in it. Well, according to the Book of Enoch, it was Azazel who introduced dyes in fabric. And so it's like, well, wait a second here. Now, of course, I can make the case that Azazel is the big baddie. He's Satan himself. Does that make wearing colors in shirts satanic, right? He introduced it first to humanity. He also introduced the sword to humanity. He introduced weapons, but we know that weapons go back to Genesis chapter 3, when the cherub comes to guard with the flaming sword. So we know that these things came from heaven itself. And so with a lot of these pagan cultures, they're disseminating things into the culture that actually has an originality in heaven. Here's a great example in Exodus is the Ark of the Covenant. Now, I've seen a lot of individuals argue that the Ark of the Covenant could not have been a rectangular box because if it is, it's pagan. And you see the images on there, like, well, it's pagan. It's like, well, no, it's not. Just because the Egyptians had boxes just like that does not mean it's pagan. And this is where we have to understand that one family came off the ark and they came from the Sethite religion. And this religion disseminated into all the earth as well. And I will say one more point too, to what you were saying, Chuck, is that isn't it interesting how all throughout Scripture, even in Revelation, John writing Revelation, this glorious angel comes before him, and the angel's like, whoa, don't worship me. And it's this desire. You're in the presence. Like if we saw these gods in their glory, we would just be on our faces like, I'm not worthy, like in a Wayne's World or something like that. And so it's just something to think about. And of course, what do the other cultures do with this information? Now, there was this comment here. I'm going to post this here just so everybody can see it. This is a great comment. And I don't want to talk about 70 AD or go down that rabbit trail. For those of you who are unfamiliar with this channel, if you are just kind of tuning in, I put in for the last 5 years a lot of research into the Millennial Kingdom and the Dark Ages, which is one of the reasons I'm having this conversation now. And it was actually this comment by C.S. Lewis that actually really got me thinking. I'm so grateful he did this. Now, I want to make clear with C.S. Lewis is that the guy was an atheist for years. And there's a intellectual quality to a lot of atheists that I actually really appreciate. Because a lot of atheists, they have a way of looking at the Bible with a certain bias or non-bias, you can call it, that they will just call things out in the Bible that that a lot of Christians refuse to see. So he's C.S. Lewis here made this comment. He's commenting on Matthew 24. He says he was wrong. Now, I don't know if this is an exact quote or not, but the sentiments are basically what C.S. And keep in mind, C.S. Lewis is a former atheist. He wore his emotions on his sleeve. If anybody has read the book Surprised by Joy, I mean, C.S. Lewis says some things like wowzers, like, just raw brutality, kind of honesty about, his feelings with the faith. But he said he was wrong, speaking of Messiah. He clearly knew no more about the end of the world than anyone else. It is certainly the most embarrassing verse in the Bible. Now, I do think that passage, that last line there by Lewis I remember him saying that specifically about Matthew 24, speaking about this generation. And I remember when I read that from Lewis. Now, I don't know the context of what point of his life. It could have been his atheist years. It could have been coming back to Christianity young. We don't really know. I mean, I don't really know. But I read that and go, wait, what? What are you talking about, Lewis? And it caused me to look into that and go, you're right, Lewis. Like, he did prophesy the end in that generation. And this is one of those things I enjoy with that kind of rawness from atheist kind of minds, where they could look at this and go, all you Christians out there, you're expecting Matthew 24 to happen. What? And then, this is like the fig tree generation, like 2000 years. It's like, no, it was supposed to happen then. And I agree. I think that it did happen then. I think by 70 AD, the Bible was fulfilled, Revelation happened, but that's a different discussion. I just wanted to point that out. So I'm actually really appreciative of him.
Matthew 24 is one of those verses that if you're intellectually honest with the text, either the end of the world happened in that generation or he's a liar. I mean, if you're intellectually honest with what it actually says, he told them that. And if it didn't come to pass, he lied. Like there's no other way to look at that first. So it is.
One of the things, I'm starting to say more and more often is sorry to disappoint if you're waiting around for the end of the world, but it already happened. So end of the world already happened. All right, well, let's start look at this. We're already almost 40 minutes into this, and we haven't hit the first book yet. So this could be a long night. So let's go right into this. Jupiter and the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I'm going to read through this whole section on the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and then you guys can comment about it. Jupiter is the sovereign planet, the god enthroned over all the other gods. To the Greeks, he is Zeus. To the Romans, he is Jove, where we get the term jovial. He is an enthroned king at peace. Jupiter is the archetype of all that is kingly, as Lewis says in his book, The Discarded Image. And this is a quote from Lewis right here. But we must think of a king at peace, enthroned, taking his leisure, serene. The jovial character is cheerful, festive, yet temperate, tranquil, and magnanimous. When this planet dominates, we may expect halcyon days, basically happy days, and prosperity. In Dante, wise and just princes go to his sphere when they die. He is the best planet and is called the greater fortune, Fortuna Major. And this comes from C.S. Lewis, The Discarded Image. Now, the author of the book, Ward, shows us how the jovial spirit is the organizing principle of the lion. One example among many, Ward brings attention to Aslan's sacrifice. And to quote the author, Lewis was not so much interested in how the atonement worked as in the fact that it worked. Now, if you guys are familiar with Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, he talked about the witch knew the magic from the dawn of time, but she didn't look further back to understand the magic before the dawn of time. I think if I'm quoting that right. How questions, though useful up to a point, were, in his view, inexhaustible, or the how questions, the how and the why of the atonement. We can never look at the atonement from the outside, determining scientifically its means of operation. And I've seen people, they get tripped up on this and they just debate it and they debate it and they debate it to the point that people are like, even the atonement is pagan. I mean, I've seen it from all different points of, different discussions. But getting back to this, the relative quantities of human and divine action, the precise calibration of juridical elements, At some point, we must simply enjoy it as one feature of the divine life. Myers approaches the right kind of opinion when she says, the desired response to The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is not to believe in the suffering of Christ, but to taste it, as Jane tasted kingship in that hideous strength. That's a reference to the Ransom trilogy right there. The kingship offered to our palates in The Lion, the kingship offered to our palates in The Lion is a fuller-bodied kingship than that in the final Ransom book. And vicarious suffering is only one ingredient in it, but the principle Myers enunciates is correct. This sacrificial bloodshed is not an end in itself, then. Rather, it is important for what it achieves. The overthrow of all anti-festal forces as symbolized by the Saturnine winter. That right there is page 70 of his book, but that is huge. And then maybe we can, after I read this, we can stop to kind of dissect and appreciate this. So basically, the atonement, the sacrificial bloodshed of C.S. Lewis's Aslan, which is, of course, Jupiter, but it's obviously Aslan, Christ himself. Rather, it is important for what it achieves. So he doesn't really get into the specifics of it, but more, experiencing what it achieves. And it is this: the overthrow of all anti-festal forces as symbolized by Saturnalia, or the Saturnine winter. And to quote Ward again, jovial symbolism is simply appropriated and put to work as Christian symbolism. In this respect, Lewis is ingeniously reversing the normal pattern of his medieval and Renaissance sources. In Spencer, as in Milton and many others, Jove is often Jehovah incognito. In The Lion, the divine figure is Jove incognito. One quick point. On this reading, it makes sense of things like Father Christmas showing up. It isn't random like some people think. It's intentional to Lewis's jovial tableau. All right. Handing over to you guys. What are you guys' thoughts on this?
You care if I go first, John, or do you want to go first?
Go for it.
Go ahead, Chuck.
All right. So I took some brief notes on this section because I did find his take on this fascinating, the author himself. His comment was one of the biggest ones, like the one that you honed in on, Noel, was one of the biggest ones that I honed in on too. But some of the earlier stuff, it kind of highlights some of the turns in Christian thinking. So in his comment, like, Lewis was not so much interested in how the atonement worked as the fact that it worked. It struck me as like this. It's true to a point if you can take a step back and take the 1,000-foot view of it. But so many Christians don't take the 1,000-foot view of it. They take the microscopic view of that statement. And in the sense that they have a very similar outlook to that. Like, they don't really want to know how the atonement worked. They just need to know that it worked. And then they claim that. Like, they don't look at anything else in the picture. They just go, oh, he died for me, I'm good. And they stop there. They don't do any more investigation. But if you take a look backwards and read the history of how Israel came to that point and all of the cosmological things that happened to get it to that point, and even taking a microscopic look at Torah and how it applies to the redemption story, it's much easier to see that when you back out to that 1,000-foot view of what all the details were. And the statement that at some point we must simply enjoy it as one of the features of divine life, it seems eerily similar to the live by faith arguments that seem to ignore the doing aspects of what faith is, which do require further investigation. It's like, I am saved as your starting point, and then you're supposed to do more investigative work. Whereas Lewis, it's like, this is a really cool story, but it also requires more investigative work on your part to look at the granular details and go, what are these things representing? What is the detail here that's being looked at? And then his core statement, the overthrow of all anti-festal forces is symbolized by Saturnine winter. So this analogy I loved. That sent chills up my spine when I first read it. I was like, ooh, that's a really hot take. I like that. And it's a somewhat forgotten and ignored knowledge of what happened in the crucifixion, because Yod came to free the people from the gods and did in fact declare war on them while he was here on earth. He went to their stomping grounds and said,
Yeah.
I'm here, like, come fight me. It's over. It's about to end. I'm marking my territory. I know this is your territory, and I'm here to declare war on you. Because you didn't do what Dad said, and I did. And now I'm here now, and I'm letting you know. Like, I'm making my statement. So it was both a very physical victory as well as a spiritual victory. Like, it is just, like, when you understand in things to that level in Scripture, it just sends chills down your spine when someone makes a statement like that. And I think that's just purely fascinating that he covered both the physical victory of Aslan over the winter as well as the spiritual victory over sin. Like, that dichotomy, once I saw it, was just like, oh, that's really nifty. So I hadn't put 2 and 2 together on that one too, but that's really nifty. The symbology that he used to describe that. And he saw both the physical and the spiritual victory there. So that's what I got there.
Yeah, that's a really powerful point, Chuck. That's pretty insightful. I agree. I think I agree with everything you just said. The one note I had on this one, on the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, was, that's the story where that has the atonement. And what's interesting is, I think, just in general, overall, looking at Lewis's Aslan character, that it is very consistent with Yahweh is Yahusha theology. Aslan himself atoned for the traitor's guilt in Lion, the Witch, and Wardrobe, and he also created the world in the Magician's Nephew.
Well, and to that point,
so
doesn't Aslan actually say, like, don't quote the old magics at me, witch, like I was there when they were written? Like, that's a line that he delivers to her in the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And who do we know created everything? Even as you said, back in the other book, he created everything. So, like, it's a callback. I think it's really cool.
Yeah, it's kind of I've actually kind of come way back more towards Lewis's understanding of the White Witch killing Aslan. For a while, I was kind of critical of that. This idea that Lewis's idea is that the White Witch didn't really know what she was doing when she killed him, because she thought she would do away with him for good, right? She didn't understand that he had the upper hand all along, and that when somebody, an innocent victim, takes the place of a guilty person and dies on his behalf, that death itself reverses, right? And it's interesting because when you look at medieval theology and you look at, like, the Gospel of Nicodemus and others, and I've covered this a lot, the idea that Messiah came and he was a Trojan horse, that when Hasatan had him killed, and he was, of course, top management, and he had the Jews kill him, he according to the Gospel of Nicodemus, he didn't even understand he was the Messiah. So this takes a little bit of a turn from the White Witch knowing who Aslan is. But, Satan takes Messiah down to Sheol, and he thinks he's putting him away down there. And then it's just all, to pun on words, all hell breaks loose. And, he just, like, rips open the gate and he sends everybody, all the captives, free. So I found that interesting. We're going to be talking more about the White Witch as we go on, as she represents the kind of duality of, I think, of wisdom, the evil wisdom, as James says in his epistle, the worldly demonic wisdom. And of course, being descended from Lilith, which is interesting in and of itself. And, the children of Lilith are at war with the sons of Adam. And so you guys have any more thoughts on this? Oh, yeah, there's one more thing I did want to talk about. That one of the heavy pieces of criticism in The Lion, the Witch, and Wardrobe, I did a video on this a year ago, which took a lot of flack as well. And some people just cannot get past this. So, of course, this is a children's story. And starting out, Lucy, the little girl, Lucy Pevensie, she goes through the wardrobe and she meets a faun. Now, this faun, of course, is clearly based on Pan, and I've done a lot to show that Pan actually originates from Ham, and I actually think Ham could have become a faun creature think that's very, very possible, as many in that generation were becoming different things. But the idea is that with Pan, and we can get into Peter Pan and the Lost Boys and all that was going on there with the pirates and the terrible things that happen to children, without getting too specific. I think everyone knows what I'm talking about. Is that Pan was luring Lucy into his cave to sexually molest her and maybe do worse things to her. And so some people can't get past that, why Lewis would have a story about Pan doing this to a child. And this comes up a lot. And I'm kind of like, well, wait a second here. What Lewis is saying here is he's not glorifying, he's not secretly confessing that I am a part of this circuit of children that it's like, no, he's not saying that. He's taking this terrible situation and saying that nobody is beyond redemption, that any of the pagan gods can choose to, of course, he was under the pay of the White Witch. He was under the pay of, in this case, the children of Lilith. But anyone can choose to repent and turn to Aslan, after he defeated death. Would you guys agree with that? Yes, no?
Yeah, that's a good take.
Yep.
One thing I never really contemplated until a point that you just made, when you said that in Messiah's atonement, right, he went down to Sheol and broke the gates, as was prophesied, and set all the sinners free. Do you think he had the ability or the authority to go to Sheol without having died to set them free? It's a question I've never asked before.
Well, it's a question I've asked, and it's something that kind of like the atonement itself. It's kind of like, and this is one of the, when people really get into the atonement arguments and they start digging, they're like, I've seen a lot of people conclude, no, his death had nothing to do with anything. He just was murdered. He just died. It had nothing to do with anything. They just killed him and he resurrected. I don't necessarily agree with that. I mean, we see this with the in Leviticus with the Azazel goat versus the Yehovah goat. I've covered this a lot, and how on the Day of Atonement, which is the holiest day of the year, the Day of Atonement is the one day when everyone's sins can be forgiven. And I've pointed this out many times that there's as Yahushua HaMashiach or Jesus Christos or Jesus Christ, whatever names out there you guys say, as our high priest of the Melchizedek priesthood, nothing has changed. What he did was the same thing we see the priest doing on the Day of Atonement for thousands of years, where on that day they would lay a hand on the Azazel goat, they would ascribe all sin onto him, they would send him out into the wilderness where he would be restless out in the wilderness, they would slaughter the Yehovah goat, they would sprinkle the blood on the mercy seat, and it's the only day of the year when all sin is forgiven. A lot of people, they don't understand the sacrificial system, that there is actually not forgiveness for conscious sin in the Torah, except on the Day of Atonement. It's the big day. So we see this with Messiah. He goes up there, and we see that the Azazel goat, Barabbas, Yahushua Barabbas, or his name is first name is Yahusha as well, I think. And they ascribe all sin onto him, and the Jews say, let it be on our heads, right, and that kind of stuff. And they set him free and they slaughter him. So there's something very, very, very powerful, no doubt, in the Torah to his crucifixion. And the question that you asked, Chuck, is, did he have to die to go down to Sheol? I don't know. I can't answer that. It's one of those things I cannot answer, but it's a brilliant move. Just, being a total Trojan horse, totally playing Satan, trolling him, and, making him think he wasn't who he was. And
it just fits into the narrative too well. Like when he says, like, I have to die in order to redeem those people. Like, but you're so often confronted with the question from atheists or non-Christians, which is a valid question. It's like, why did he have to die though? If he's all powerful, why did he have to die? Why didn't he just go down there and redeem them? Why didn't he just destroy his enemies? And because the universe has rules. Like, there are authority figures, and at that point, did he have the authority? Just he's the obedient son before his death, right? He hasn't obeyed his father to the point of death at this point yet. So he obeys his father. He does exactly what his dad tells him to do. He dies so that he can go redeem those that were lost. According to, I think it's James, like he was picked from among his peers for loving the things that his father loved. And I would say his father and mother loved. He embodied the qualities of both of them. And so, like, did he have to die in order to gain the authority to go to Sheol to set them free in the first place? Like, was that part of the rules? Like, I don't know. Like, it's just, I've never contemplated it until I thought of it in the terms of Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe.
It's a rule of justice. Justice requires due payment. If I take my keys and I scratch your car, do a key job on your car, you can forgive me, but somebody's going to pay for that. Either you're going to pay for that out of your own pocket to get it fixed, or the value of your car goes down, so you pay for it when you resell or whatever, or I'm going to pay for it through restitution. But somebody has to pay for it. That's with any wrong against anybody. Somebody has to pay for it. You just can't make it just go away.
Now, I want to move on to, and I fully agree, John Q. When we talk about magic too, C.S. Lewis actually referred to magic as science's twin, I believe. And he actually has a little bit of play on that with the magician's nephew. But, he was kind of a generation that was, because a lot of people say, like, well, magic is evil. He's not talking about witchcraft. He's not talking about that kind of magic. He's talking about in the context of natural science itself. And so this is like with Aslan's resurrection, the magic from, was it before the dawn of time or whatever, it starts reversing itself, right? This is the law of nature itself that does this. So, all right, let's keep moving on to Mars and Prince Caspian. We're in this for a whole hour now. We're only on the second book. So let's push this up so we can maybe not do a part two. Mars and Prince Caspian. Mars is the god of war. To the Greeks, he is Ares. Now, this is where it's going to really start clicking in with you guys. You're like, oh my goodness. By the time we get to like the horse, like the silver chair and the horse and his boy, it becomes so obvious that he was basing each of these books, that like the writer here is not just making this up. He's not reading between he's like, it's so obvious. All right, anyways. Mars is the god of war. To the Greeks, he is Ares, the son of Zeus and Hera, or Jupiter and Juno. And in his poem, The Planets, Lewis describes the god of war as necessity's son. Taken aright, Mars strengthens noble warriors and gives resolve to the martyr. In Out of the Silent Planet, Lewis calls Mars the name Malacandra. Ransom observes the warlike nature of the preparations for the, I don't even know how to pronounce this, Hanakra hunt. And it speaks of something long sleeping in his blood. No, that's the Ransom trilogy there. So getting into Prince Caspian. In the Narniad, I actually like that. I'm going to start calling that the Narniad. Mars corresponds to Prince Caspian. Lewis had his eye on creating a martial atmosphere, and indeed, the very word martial appears twice in Prince Caspian, the only one of the 7 chronicles in which it occurs at all. Reepicheep is described as a martial mouse, and Miraz frets over his martial policy. Now, pay attention there, because what C.S. Lewis is doing is playing with duality. There's always duality to counter everything. There's good and evil. We see this in the Torah, for example. Moses is the example of righteousness, and then you have Balaam to balance that out on the other side. Now, when you get into the book of Jasher, you see Balaam play a much larger role in the life of Moses. He's just there the whole time with Moses, just the two of them going at it. And then we see the same thing with when you get into Paul. You have Simon Magus. Now, again, Balaam only shows up for like 3 chapters in Numbers. Simon Magus shows up in 1 chapter in Acts, but then you get into the extra biblical literature again. Simon Magus is all over the place, like recognitions of Clement, the Acts of Peter, Paul, and so on and so forth. And he's that duality to Paul. So we're going to see the same thing with Prince Caspian has the duality with Miraz. They're both kind of the Mars, the good and the bad. So in something of a martial pun, marshals are appointed to oversee the list. The martial temperament is one of sturdy hardiness, according to the discarded image, and the martial visage is hard and happy, according to the planets. Hold on, someone's calling here. I'll have to tell Rebecca not to call me while I'm live. All right, Ward again. Martial hardness then is not to be. She's calling again. Okay. Sorry, Rebecca, hanging up on you. All right. wait, hold on. Wait. Okay. Okay, she's calling me again. Okay. Rebecca, if you hear this, I'm live right now. Martial hardness then is not to be confused with heartlessness or the gratification of lust for physical power. Rather, properly understood, it is that strength which, on the one hand, gives backbone to the milksop, and on the other hand, reins in machismo. Within these two extremes, war service, if it is necessary, may be entered into with a kind of gaiety and wholeheartedness. So as Mars, Aslan commands the army in Prince Caspian, he marshals and inspires his troops. Knightliness is Mars taken aright. So we're talking chivalry here, right? So the idea is with medieval thinking is chivalry is everything. Like a man wants to inspire to that kind of, enlightenment, to be chivalrous. And we see this in a few examples in Prince Caspian, whereas Miraz is the opposite of chivalrous. We see Peter exemplifies this when he doesn't take advantage of Miraz tripping during the one-on-one combat. And Peter says, I suppose it is what Aslan would like. I don't know if you guys can hear that, but she keeps calling me. So I'm just going to have to let that play out. Can you guys hear the phone ringing right now? Okay, good. All right. Martyrdom, not knighthood, is the summit of martial achievement and contains no worldly dignity or honor, only crucifixion like shame that must be despised. Hebrews 12:2. So in Prince Caspian, Lewis gives us 3 martyrs, that is, 3 characters who witness to the truth and suffer for it. Caspian's nurse, Dr. Cornelius, and Lucy Pavinci. Mars Sylvanus is an early form of Mars and is a god of vegetation, which is why the spring month of March is named after him. Now, this is where it kind of gets interesting. And this explains the force attacking the Talmarines at the end. You guys remember that the trees come alive and attack everyone, right? Well, this is another big controversy in the Chronicles of Narnia is Bacchus. Now, in Rome, the festival of Mars began on the first of the month, but the Bacchanalian festivities, the mysteries of Bacchus, began immediately following the Ides of March, which explains why we also see Bacchus at the end of Prince Caspian. It also explains, and I found this fascinating, it also explains why we see Miraz betrayed and stabbed in the back by his own men, just as Julius Caesar was assassinated on the Ides of March. I never saw that till now. Now I'll never unsee that. This also right here, this is the last paragraph, and then we'll discuss. I will point out really quickly that when you go to Oxford, you go to Magdalene College, of course, you can go. The original Treebeard just died. Unfortunately, he died like the year before I went there, and he was cut down, and I never got to see Treebeard. But there's a lot of things there you see with Tolkien and Lewis, like you can go see the lamppost and the fawn and all that kind of stuff. Right outside of Magdalene College, there is a bridge over the river right there, and they have a picture of Bacchus's face on there. And I saw that, I'm like, whoa, because that's what happens at Prince Caspian. When the river god comes out and demands that they break the bridge so that the river can flow, and that's when Bacchus comes in. But anyways, Mars is associated with wolves, woodpeckers, and horses. All 3 are in Prince Caspian. The werewolf fights with Prince Caspian. The arrows thocking into woods are described as the stroke of a woodpecker. And Caspian's horse is named Destrier, which means war horse or charger. The equivalent of Mars in Norse mythology is Tyr or Tu, which is where we get Tuesday. And Tyr protects the community by binding a wolf, but had his hand bitten off in the process. So again, this gets interesting because Caspian is bit by the werewolf in a skirmish. Lewis says elsewhere that lycanthropy was possible in knights who didn't tame their inner animal inside of chivalry. The Turkish form of Mars means torch, and we see the appearance of torches in Prince Caspian. And the children attempt to make torches but fail, but they are able to use Edmund's electric torch, his flashlight. So obviously in Prince Caspian, we see Mars everywhere. And of course, we could just go on and on and on for hours, I'm sure, talking about Prince Caspian. What are your guys' thoughts?
Yeah. one of the things you talked about martyrdom there, right? And one of the things that it was Yahusha said, I think it was in Matthew 24 that this great tribulation that would come, it would be there'd be none like it prior and nothing again like it following that, right? Ever to come again. And those early church martyrs went through some really, really horrific tribulation. I mean, it was just horrific. But there was a purpose to that, right? So it was because of those early church martyrs that skeptics today, when they take the time to, try to debunk the story of Messiah's death and resurrection, and they seriously start looking into it, they can only conclude that it was real because no one dies for something they know is a lie. And a famous example of that would be Lee Strobel, who wrote The Case for Christ.
So in this one,
Yeah, I agree.
That's a great summary. And I see the mentality, just having been in the military and having to deal with the relational aspects of military service and military life, what people are willing to do and the type of mentality that you have to have, like, it's conflict, right? And you can take this even in personal relationships or between friends or marital partners or whatever. And a conflict between people, a lot of the time, the base emotion can be fear or uncertainty. Like, that's, you don't know the outcome. You're terrified of the thing that's coming up. So it is much like war in that aspect. And the idea of this martial hardness of being entered into with kind of a gaiety and wholeheartedness, like he says, it's refreshing. Like both in any personal conflict that you might have or in wrestling with our Creator, like Jacob did, right? Where you have this, I'm going to have to deal with this. So why am I going to enter into this conflict with fear and uncertainty? Why not with a sense of joy and duty? And I'm in it with my whole heart. You're not going to win obviously the goal of a personal conflict isn't to win. It's to come to a resolve, right? To come to an equilibrium, to be back in relation. But I mean, in a sense, that's what Jacob did when he wrestled with the angel. They hit a point of parity and where they couldn't go on any further. And Jacob said, well, I need something from you now to move on, right? So he was in it with his whole heart and he wasn't giving up. And he was also pleased with the results of it. And like in Peter, when he doesn't take advantage of Miraz tripping, well, we're not to take advantage of each other's weaknesses in our conflicts either, in our wars that we fight. It should be noble and edifying in anything that we enter into. That should be our goal, is to maintain our level of righteousness in what we're doing. And if you can't go into it with a sense of joy and with your whole heart, seeking not only an equilibrium, but also the other person's, like, you would want them to have an honorable death if you have to kill them, like in a war. You're not there to degrade them and to make them less than you. It's a conflict. Like, and in a interpersonal conflict, like this idea of gaiety and wholeheartedness in a personal conflict, like my goal is to edify the other person as much as I can while trying to maintain a level of peace. So that's always what you're trying to get back to, I think. So I thought that was a fascinating take on Mars, and C.S. Lewis relates it pretty perfectly in a lot of his relationships that he has in the books. And with Peter's example with Miraz too, that was a really fascinating take on things.
All right, well, now we're going into my two favorite books in the series. And one of the reasons, so quick review here on the movies, and I was talking to John Q about this a few weeks ago when he came over and we visited for a week, was, people criticize Disney for how evil they are, which is kind of interesting that they don't criticize, really all the Hollywood studios. I mean, the Hollywood studios pump out a lot of stuff. That being said, the Disney from 15 years ago is not the same Disney as today. And now C.S. Lewis specifically kind of always cringed at the idea of Disney taking his property, and then it happened for better or for worse. And I remember in 2005, they released The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which that and Prince Caspian weren't that bad. They were actually pretty good. I thought they were done by, was it Andrew Adamson or whatever his name was, who had a lot of love for the material. And then Disney sold it off, and then Fox bought it, and then they did The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, and I thought that was an atrocity. And they didn't know what to do with it because they were trying to make it for modern audiences where you know, every single movie has to be like, you got to save the world, you know. You know, you look at, like, for example, like the original Back to the Future movie from 1985. A lot of people maybe forget that whole movie, he just wanted his parents to fall in love. Like, he wasn't going to try to save the world, right? He was just wanted, you know, it was just a very simple story. And the thing with The Voyage of the Dawn Treader is understanding Arthurian literature, where the narrative is not stitched together by like some big baddie got to save the world. It's literally just going on this quest and as you meet one encounter, the next, and they're just loosely based on each other. It's all about the purification of the soul and learning to overcome the world and become chivalrous, which is all what The Voyage of the Dawn Treader is. So they just botched the whole story. They didn't know what to do with it. So let's get into this right here. Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. So we covered Jupiter, we covered Mars. Now we're on to the sun itself. To the Greeks, Sol is Apollo, the god of the sun. Sol is particularly associated with gold, the most noble metal. These and many other characteristics are found in the voyage. After our Narnian voyagers discover the pool that turns everything to gold, they all witness Aslan in the distance. Now, this is a quote from the book. Across the gray hillside above them, gray, for the heather was not in bloom, without noise and without looking at them, and shining as if he were in bright sunlight, though the sun had in fact gone in, passed with slow pace the hugest line that human eyes have ever seen. In describing the scene, Lucy said afterwards, he was the size of an elephant, though at another time she only said the size of a cart horse. But it was not the size that mattered. Nobody dared to ask what it was. They knew it was Aslan. So Ward says, Lewis's primary concern is not with the literal sun. The sun had, in fact, gone in. He is concerned with the tone, or I'm sorry, he is concerned with the one of whom the sun is an image, the golden lion. Nobody dared to ask what it was. They knew it was Aslan, an echo of John 21:12, which says, none of the disciples dared ask him, who are you? So Ward talks about the gray heather signifying the cursedness of the island, and also an allusion to the hoard of Spencer's mammon, which is gray and which is set out in the sun to make it gold. Ward gives a great compliment here. This episode is an example of Lewis's skill in blending romance, medieval astrology, literary and biblical allusion, and his own suppositional allegory. The powers of coordination and translation required to achieve such a sophisticated imaginative mix without overwhelming the narrative, indeed without making the narrative seem anything other than entirely natural and consistent, should not be underestimated. So basically, the writer of this article is saying what Lewis is doing here is simply remarkable. In the Greek form, Apollo was famously known as a killer of dragons. This is what really blew my mind. Apollo the lizard slayer. Sara is the Greek for lizard, serpent, worm, or dragon. And as soon as I saw Tolkien, I'm like, okay, I know where this is going. Tolkien names his chief villain in The Lord of the Rings, Sauron, which, again, Satan is a dragon. He's actually, I believe, a seraphim angel. That these dragons are actually angelic beings. In the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, there are 4 slain dragons. Lewis is enlisting Sol as Apollo here. The first dragon is seen in chapter 6. It's old and dying, and the Narnia voyagers witness its death. Lewis makes mention of the sun beating down and then leaving. Ward argues this is redolent of a story found in the hymn of Apollo. The second dragon is Eustace himself, who is transformed into a dragon because of his sin, and he is defeated by submitting to Aslan, Apollo, or Sol Incognito. And my favorite character in the whole Narnia series is actually Eustace. I think he has the best story arc, the best character development. He was much more, I really love him a lot. I love the whole story of him transforming, being baptized, and it's this painful process where Aslan is like ripping into his skin and tearing it out, and And the idea that that's one of Lewis's allegories that he plays with in his other books, where when he wants to transform us into a beautiful creation or soul, it's really painful for us, and we fight back. And we're like, I don't want, and it's the idea of a guy taking a rock and chiseling at the rock, and the rock is crying out in pain, but the rock doesn't understand that within is this beautiful statue that he's trying to get out. And that's what Aslan did with the dragon. And as he ripped the skin off and created the beautiful creature within. The third dragon is the sea serpent, which tries to crush the ship. Gotta love those sea serpents. I've talked about them a lot. Not fictional creatures, of course. I think that they really existed until very recently. I don't know where they all went. I think they're still around. The fourth dragon is the Dawn Treader itself, with its stern in the shape of a dragon's tail. Its bow sprite is a dragon's head, and the sides dragon wings. Now, the ship itself is a symbol of Prince Caspian's own avariciousness. Man, this is killing me with the words tonight. I'm sorry. I'm just so many words I don't usually read. All dragons collect gold, says Edmund in connection to the dragon that is Eustace. The dragon-shaped ship, which was built by Prince Caspian with its own quarters decorated with crimson dragons. Caspian is noble and heroic, but not immune to the worst kind of motivations. Caspian is intent on taking over Aslan's country. Aslan's soul intervenes and burns away the dross of Caspian's ignoble ambitions, which just, again, that's just crazy. This idea that this great king, kind of the King David kind of character of Narnia is, he's actually building a ship that is, even though he doesn't become a dragon like Eustace, he actually is building a ship that is really in the shape of his own heart, that he's literally going to despoil Aslan's country and take home the treasures for himself. And Aslan lets him do this. And he doesn't just destroy the ship. He actually, works on each of them as they go along, which again is the Arthurian literature right here. Aslan appears 7 times in the voyage, and each time he becomes more solar. Aslan appears in the beam of light as a cross, playing kite, then a bird. And finally, at the end, we have another Johannine aspect when Edmund asks Aslan, "Are you there in our world too, sir?" One of my favorite lines in the whole series, to which Aslan replies, "I am," which has dual reference to the tetragram and also to Christ's statement, "I am the light of the world." And Sol Victus, of course, is everywhere in the voyage. So, thoughts, guys? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, of course. There's 7 I ams that Yahusha utters in the New Testament. I am the light of the world being one of them. I am the bread of life. I am the way. So yeah, there's that number 7 again that we've been talking about.
Yeah, on this one, I thought that the sun imagery with soul is really interesting because it's just so ever present in our world. We don't take it for we take it for granted sometimes what it is. Like, it's there. Like, oh, it's the daytime, it's the night, it's the light, it's the darkness. Like, you don't stop to contemplate it. And I thought that his acknowledging that they never looked up and had to question what it was. They just knew it was Aslan. Like it just you look back in what most people would consider to be pagan, or you even think of it in terms of the Native Americans. There was an aspect of sun reverence in their culture. They just were like, oh yeah, that's him, that's the god, we just know it's him. We don't think about it. We give him praise for giving the things to us that he gives to us. They didn't think about it. So I thought that aspect was pretty interesting. And then the dragon references always it brought to mind the office of a Satan instead of necessarily the person of a Satan, that anybody can then hold that office in opposition to Yah. And essentially that's what Eustace took on, was the role of an opposer. He was just someone that was opposed. And then, we can all take on that role and be used in that role from time to time if we allow ourselves to be. So you're not immune to that role of becoming that dragon. And it's only when you repent that he tears you back down and makes you into what you were supposed to be, which is submissive to him. So I thought that was really interesting too.
Now, obviously, within medieval imagery, we have St. George and the Dragon. Now, I covered St. George and the Dragon a few months ago now, and I gave a big case on why I believe he was Elijah. And that's a side note. One of the things I was picking up when you read the original St. George documents, they talk about how he slayed the dragon, but the dragon that he slayed was actually a person, and that there was a dragon living within the person. Of course, this dragon was Hasatan himself, and he slays the person that is embodied by the actual serpent. So in this, and so the idea of a knight slaying a dragon, or St. George slaying a dragon, the exoteric is that we see him slaying this, this slithery kind of winged creature that kind of looks like a basilisk, and that could be very well the case. But the esoteric is that you're actually it's the duality of chivalry. It's a complete opposite of chivalry. You want to destroy the dragon within yourself or the dragon within anybody, right? And so in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, when we see that, obviously King Caspian he's kind of heading in that dragon direction. He's kind of thinking like a dragon. Even though he's being very noble and chivalrous, he wants to go despoil this land, right? But Eustace, he goes to the dragon is guarding this horde, just like we see with Smaug in the Hobbit, and Eustace becomes a dragon. Now, Repeat Chief and the others, they want to slay the dragon, right? In St. George fashion, we got to slay the dragon. But they figure out finally that this dragon is Eustace himself. And this again goes back to the Mr. Tumnus theme, where Lewis goes back to this all the time about the redemption process, that nobody is so far gone that they cannot be redeemed, that they cannot repent and come back. And so they all kind of mutually agree, okay, let's see this through and see if Eustace is going to revert back to who he was again, or if hopefully he doesn't end up having to be slayed, right? John Q, did you have anything you wanted to throw in?
No, I think I'm good for now.
Okay, let's go. Keep reading to the Silver Chair, Luna and the Silver Chair. Now, I'm going to say right off hand here that I think this one might be the one I want to comment on most. I feel like this, by the right, I don't know, I haven't read the book, so maybe the writer of this article didn't get the best fair shake. But Luna is the moon goddess. Now, I'm of the opinion that, of course, the luminaries, including the moon, is real divine beings, and that the moon is a lady. This is why we saw in the beginning she is a sad lady, because she did transgress at the beginning of time, and this is why her light decreases. She started out full all the time. She ruled the night with the sun and the day, and now she kind of has to be forced under the authority of the sun, but that's a kind of whole different discussion. Anyways, Luna is the moon goddess. She is known by several names to the Greeks, such as Selene, Artemis, and Cynthia. Since she is only permitted to rule the night, she is known as being envious of soul. And this we see in the moon witch of the underworld, who hates the realm of the day, Narnia, and diminishes the bigness of Aslan and the sun and the things like it. Ward points out that the moon witch makes arguments like Feuerbach or Freud or Marx. Now, I do know that obviously in Britain, they were very anti-communist, particularly, with the Bolshevik Revolution going to World War II. Lewis was not a fan of Freud either. And in fact, when one of the Inklings pointed out one time that they thought in the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, that the children going into the wardrobe was a Freudian psychology for wanting to re-enter our mother's womb again. He didn't take too kindly to that, I don't think. So he was not a fan of Freud. That their conception of the sun was just an extrapolation of underworld realities. I love that whole argument she makes. Like the lamp for the sun or the cap for the lion. Now, so the idea is that if you guys remember, the moon witch is like, you say there's a lion up there in the overworld, but you just saw a cat and you just imagine that there was something bigger than there really was. You see this lamp here, and so you imagine that there is a sun, because in the underworld they've never seen the sun. Of course, she's been up there and she knows, and she's deceiving them. But she's like, you see this lamp, and so you imagine there was a sun. And it's the same thing as you go further up, because if we learned in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader that the idea of Sol Victus is that if we are worshiping the sun, we are making an idol of the sun. We fail to recognize that the sun is there to point out that there is a greater light of the world beyond that. So the Moon Witch is taking the same argument that we see in the Aramaic Targum with Esau or Cain, who they do not believe in the afterlife. They actually do not believe in the kingdom above, and so on and so forth. So that's an argument as old as time itself. Ward says the Moon Witch will acknowledge no solar supremacy. Her light must be uncreaturely, self-sustaining, not derived or dependent. But the moon, as Lewis put it in an early poem, is a stone that catches the sun's beam. And this is the correct way of understanding things according to the divinely ordained great chain of being. Now, we know that the moon gives forth its own light, but as Enoch, it's not a moon it's not a rock in the sky that just reflects light, nor can that be replicated in an experiment. But the thing about what Enoch mentions is that the light of the moon does depend on the sun, that the sun does charge the moon, that the moon has to be dependent on the sun. In Lewis's poem of the planets, he describes Luna as melancholy pale. And I showed you guys the wood cutting at the beginning where the moon is melancholy. And Lewis almost overdoes it with describing so much as pale as the children descend into the witch's underworld. Aslan's instructions to Jill, oh man, I love this part. His instructions to Jill at the beginning are almost certainly, and I would say without a doubt, an allusion to the Old Testament Shema. Remember, remember, remember the signs. Say them to yourself when you wake in the morning, and when you lie down at night, and when you wake in the middle of the night. And whatever strange things may happen to you, let nothing turn your mind from following the signs. This is what we're told to do in the Torah. To wear them on us, to remind ourselves to recite them constantly, put them on the doorpost of your house. Do not forget the instructions, because if you do, you'll be led astray. And of course, in the silver chair, Jill forgets them constantly, and they're just constantly led astray. It's a horrible struggle. And I will point out, I will plug the Sabbath of the 10 Commandments, and anybody listening can check this up for yourself. There is only one command. Only one command, he says, to remember. One command, he says, remember, remember, do not forget. It's the Sabbath day. And it's the one command of the 10 that people snub, they forget, they redefine, whatever. So something to think about there. Now, I don't think Ward comments on this much, but I will add that the OT is like the moon. This is the guy writing the article here. Its light is derivative, whereas the NT is like the sun itself. Jesus is even called the day spring, the rising sun. So right there, he's describing the two pillars of actually Freemasonry, the sun and the moon. And he says it's the New Testament, Old Testament. Kind of interesting. And where I do think that this wasn't given a fair shake, it's because he's like the guy writing the article here is almost like he's almost giving the Old Testament like a negative connotation, which is typical of Protestant thinking. Of course, C.S. Lewis was no Protestant, but based on medieval thinking, like Hildegard, she describes the moon as the church itself. I agree with this. The moon is the bride. She is the woman to the sun. She is the sun's woman, the lady. And the moon transgressed, just like the church has transgressed, the ecclesia. The ecclesia goes all the way back to Sinai. And the way that Hildegard described the moon within medieval cosmology is that as it wanes and then it waxes, it goes small and diminishes to nothing, and then it grows, enlarges to where it dominates the night and then shrinks again. That this is kind of like the tide of the ocean. It represents the church. That as the church wanes on this earth, darkness comes in, and then when the ecclesia increases in morality and in virtue, and it overpowers everything, then it grows stronger. And that's what the moon is there to remind us of. Handing back to you guys, thoughts.
I don't think I have any additional thoughts. Well, I mean, I do have a lot of thoughts on the silver chair, but it's more related to the overall theology and not necessarily how it relates to the planets or the seven.
Yeah, go ahead. I mean, We have a
So-
few minutes on this. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I don't know if I want to trigger people now or wait till the end to trigger people.
Okay, let's wait till the end of the because I know where you're going with this. Let's wait to the
Yeah.
conclusion on that. And then you can highlight over each of these books. So let's just go to the next one. We'll wait. I mean, inevitably, when we talk about biblical stuff, the Bible's controversial. People get triggered. It's just that it's the nature of the book. But let's save the juiciest trigger stuff for the end. And so when people are like, "That's it, I'm unsubscribing. I made it all the way to the end of this video. I'm unsubscribing now."
On the moon, specifically, like I find the correlation between the witch and her kingdom underground interesting in the fall of Adam and Eve from paradise. I think the correlation there is really interesting. That she is essentially from the underworld or whatever, and because of Eve's transgression, they were cast down from paradise to the earth and then had to toil and do all of the things. So I think the correlation there is really interesting. And then I'd never really thought of Eve's fall being a mirror of the transgression of the moon either. Like that's a really interesting. And then they both gain their strength from the man, the sun the moon intaking the sun's light, and Eve being given her physical body from Adam's rib. There's an interesting correlation drawn there. And I don't know, I haven't read The Silver Chair, so I don't know if there's any interesting correlations in the book to that as well, where the witch is having to draw power from another source or something that is related to soul. But I just thought those were some really interesting correlations in there too. But I would have actually reversed the order. I would have said that the Torah is the representative son from the Old Testament, and that the New Testament is melancholy in the sense that it has the more feminine aspects to the outpouring of the Spirit. So that's where I would have seen the order reversed.
Well, you just like triggered. You just like, I don't know if people are going to pick up what you just said, but I
know you caught it, but I feel like that's where John's going to go with it too. So I'm just going to leave it alone and leave it at that for now.
No, he's going to go in a different direction. He's going to take this in a classic John Q direction. But let's see, what I was going to say on. So a few things to note with the transgression of the moon is one of the things that excites me about this is that when you have within ancient Christian and Jewish tradition that the texts agree on this. So when you read the Aramaic Targum, they say that the moon transgressed at the same time that Eve transgressed, and it has to do with the moon enlarging herself when Eve was doing her thing in the garden with Hasatan, and when she should not have. And you see the same thing in books like the Gospel of Bartholomew, and there's a few others, and they say the same thing, that the moon transgressed. And this is why the moon, this is one of the things that convinced me. A lot of people listening now, they're like, what are you talking about? But this is one of the things that convinced me that the new moon should be the full moon and not the crescent shape. That when the moon is at its full, that is when she is, in her glory, and it's the beginning of the months. That's always when it was intended to be. But anyways, I digress. Let's keep moving on.
I knew you'd pick up what I was putting down there, so I'm glad you filled in the blanks for the trigger people.
Yeah, but I was talking about the feminine aspects of the New Testament. I do agree that there's a lot of feminine aspects to the Old Testament. You get into wisdom literature with Proverbs and so on and so forth. But I know what you're talking about, the outpouring of the Spirit. Yeah. Mercury and the horse and his boy. Mercury is a rapid god. Mercury orbits the sun every 88 days. He is known as Hermes to the Greek and Woden to the Norsemen. Because he is fast, he is known as the messenger of the gods. Because he is a messenger, Lewis calls him the Lord of language in his poem On the Planets. He is associated with quicksilver, another name for Mercury. When Mercury is in a dish, it rolls around, dividing up into droplets and then quickly recombining back together. It is mercurial. This dividing up and coming back together is seen in The Horse and His Boy in numerous ways, astonishing ways. Most prominently is the separation of the twins Kor, or Shasta, and Corin, and their reunion. Now, I'm just giving, for those of you who have never read this, I'm just giving it away. But you find out that they are just like Luke and Leia in Star Wars. In the third one, you find out that these lover boys, this boy and girl, they were separated. Actually, no, wait, hold on. No, that's not true, because they actually get married. Wait, hold on. Mercury is thought to rule. No, I'm sorry. The boy is actually switched. I'm sorry. He is switched with another. He is actually the prince. But anyways, Mercury is thought to rule over the Gemini, which are twins in Greek mythology, Castor and Pollux. Word suggests that these twins are the models for Shasta and Corin. Homer describes Castor as a great breaker of horses and Pollux as a renowned boxer. Shasta doesn't break Bree in the conventional sense, but he does break Bree's pride and self-conceit. And Bree says, at least Shasta ran in the right direction, ran back. Cor/Shasta suggests a portmanteau, Castor. Corin floors a boy who insults Queen Susan, then the boy's brother, then the first boy again, and he threatens to knock down Thornbutt before the Battle of Anvard. He demands the box Rabidash. There are several other types of twins or pairings: 2 armies, 2 girls, 2 hands, 2 horses, etc. It's everywhere. In the beginning of the book, we have a mercurial chase. Shasta is united to Bree. Erebus is united with Hwin. They are driven close to each other, and then they come back together. I'm going to skip this paragraph for lack of time, but basically he's talking about the whole plot. It's just Mercury, separating, coming back together, separating, coming back together. Even in the way when the boy and the girl are separated, when Aslan is chasing them, they go separate directions and they come together again. Shasta has to deliver a message to the king of Archelin, which is very straightforward: Mercury, messenger of the gods' imagery. Aslan, like Mercury, is swift of foot. And throughout the story, we encounter many different lines and even a cat. And they were all the one line Aslan. A very mercurial picture of multiplicity and singularity. It's very Trinitarian. When Shasta asks who Aslan is, Aslan responds with a very deep threefold myself. One lion and a threefold myself. A Christianized Hermes, as Ward puts it. Ward does so much more here in explicating the mercurial Dongality in this book as it relates to language and words and puns and silence. It's too much to engage here, but it is fantastic. All right, guys, thoughts?
Yeah, one of the things in The Horse and His Boy, it really shows, the story really shows Lewis's understanding of how Yahweh involves himself and intervenes from time to time in human history. You learn that they're being chased on the horses. They're being chased by lions, and you come to find out, I don't want to give away too much for those who haven't read the book, but you come to find out that the lions, what they thought were multiple lions, was just one, and it was Aslan. And he was doing that in order to spur the horses on so that they would be able to reach their destination in time. And so that, and then, even in the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where Aslan actually actively participates in battles, just goes to show Lewis's sort of understanding of how Yahweh is not just a distant God, winding the clock and letting it run, but he is actively involved in human history.
Yeah, and it has been commented on in The Horse and His Boy that Aslan appears as Aslan the least in the entire Chronicles, but actually some have argued that he has the most active presence of any book in the way he is moving them to their destination. So I'm going to keep reading on, Chuck, unless you got something.
No, you're good.
We're running kind of low on time, as this often happens. And so I'm going to try to skip through this really quickly. We're going to see more duality here because we see a good Venus and an evil Venus. And I really think that this is really important, the way C.S. Lewis sees this. And I started out talking about this because people see these pagan gods are like, this is pagan. And it's like, well, what if, yeah, okay, fine. There's these pagan gods, but what if there is something on the other side that they are mimicking that is actually righteous, right? That there is a righteous counterpart to what they're talking about. So Venus is the laughter-loving goddess. In Greek, she is known as Aphrodite. In The Magician's Nephew, Jadis, the witch, is greeted in London with roars of laughter. in the creation of Narnia, we see plenty of laughter. And they tell the first joke. It goes on and on and on, to the point when I was reading The Magician's Nephew recently, I'm like, why does Lewis talk about laughter so much? But that makes sense. He's telling you, and he's spelling it out for you, we're talking about Venus. Now, this again, talking about duality, the witch Jadis is derived from the warrior goddess Ishtar. Now, I've done my research on this, and of course, Ishtar, I believe, is related to Semiramis, Nimrod's wife, and she also, her tradition goes all the way back to Lilith, who was, Lilith was a siren-like owl goddess, a tree nymph of Babylonian literature, but we also, there's the high speculation based on a lot of books that it was one of Adam's wives as well. So she is the Babylonian version of Venus. I pointed out that I believe Venus is the counterfeit Ruach HaKodesh, or the Holy Spirit. And Venus is worshipped by the Ninevites. So here's what's interesting about this. She is Venus infernal, the evil influence of Venus. So Jadis refers to Charn, this is the world, her city, where she comes from, as that great city, which is an echo of God's final words to Jonah, should I not pity Nineveh, the great city. I've also did a whole report on this where the imagery is shocking, and it looks very much like Tartaria to me, like the destruction of Tartaria that occurred. A lot of, in my opinion, so the thing is that what Lewis was doing was, he's playing with an audience where a lot of kind of young Earth creationist crowds are really big on Lewis, and he was very clever in not having Narnia be destroyed and rebuilt. Dealing with Genesis 1, this idea of recreation, destruction, recreation, which of course is my view, something that I push here a lot. And so what he does is he destroys this one world, this world of Charn, and then he moves the witch over to this new world. And it's a very clever kind of sleight of hand where he doesn't have to deal with, the whole, I think that Lewis is probably an old earther, and he thinks there was probably multiple creations beforehand, if I had to guess. But it's a very clever sleight of hand on his part not to have to deal with that critique from a large theological segment of the population. All right, so Venus being a goddess of beauty and sexuality means she is associated with fertility and creation. So what I'm saying here is that with the Magician's Nephew, even Magician's Nephew, the very title is duality. You see two things going on. You see the boy Diggory, who represents the everything that is good of magic, whereas the magician, the magician himself, his uncle, is everything wrong with magic. It's the polarity, and we see the same thing, of course, with Venus. We see the good Venus, the creation of the world, the evil Venus, which is the white witch. He says here, Venus is the morning star. Peter refers to Christ as the morning star, 2 Peter 1:19, and Jesus himself refers to himself as the morning star in John's Apocalypse, Revelation 22:16. Isaiah also refers to Lucifer as the morning star, Isaiah 14:12. I was talking to Pamela today, who is translating the Paleo for us, and just wanted to confirm this with her, and she said that she has never read a manuscript that ever says Lucifer. So Lucifer is a modern insertion into Isaiah 14:12, just to point that out. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get through the last battle. Let's finish this, and we'll just talk about it. We'll end it tonight, and then John Q will trigger everybody. Saturn in the last battle, which is great because I trigger people all the time, so I don't have to tonight. So this is great. Saturn is the god of time in Roman mythology. C.S. Lewis already set this up in the Silver Chair. He knew where he was going with this, and so they go down into the earth and they see Father Time down there, and he's asleep, and they say that once he wakes up, the end of the world's going to come, and we actually see that happen in the last battle. He is known as Kronos among the ancient Greeks. He's associated with old age, disaster, and death, among other things. Taken rightly, he can bring about godly sorrow, penitential wisdom or penitence, wisdom, and contemplative insight. This is incredible because these are things that, these are the very discussions, John Q, that we have all the time about, the end of the world, right? And we've been having that with the whole Q movement and discussing, are we looking at a negative time in history where we're all being, leading to our destruction, or are we seeing a huge mass awakening, like an enlightenment in the masses, right? And that's what you see with Kronos. It's not necessarily the end of the world. I mean, he says here, yes, he is associated with old age, disaster, death, but also with godly sorrow with penitence, wisdom, and contemplative insight. And this is what we're seeing in the world right now. We're seeing a lot of destruction in the world. I mean, right now, Los Angeles is burning as we make this video. There's a lot of destruction in the world, but there's a lot of just waking up. The mythological character Father Time with his scythe is based on earlier depictions of Saturn, which is who we see in the last battle. Father Time wakes up from his sleep and ends the world. Saturn is also associated with the mythical golden age, a kind of paradise. I'm going to skip some of this, talking about Dante and other things like that. On the darker end of the spectrum of Saturnine influence is the fact that every single character with whom the story opens is killed off by the end. Sorry to ruin this for everyone, but everyone dies. All the children that will go to Narnia, they all die in the end. They all die. Most of the story is one disaster after another. And it is. It's a depressing, for the first half of the last battle, it's depressing. Everyone's dying. You even hear all the kids are like, they die on a train by train wreck or whatever. Emeth, the Calaman soldier that we see in Narnian heaven later on, is said to be a seventh son. Tirian, similarly, is the seventh in descent from King Rilian. Saturn is the seventh planet. Ward says, perhaps the most direct theological message of the last battle is that death is not the worst thing that can happen. Rather, noble death is a treasure that no one is too poor to buy. There is so much more to say, but this has been long. I agree, because we're going on 2 hours here to get through this. I don't remember if Ward discusses this, but of course, the stable in the last battle is a symbol of Christ coming into the world. And of course, he came into the world to save it, and he saved it by dying for it. And he highly recommends it. Great book. I haven't read it yet, but I would already recommend this book. So let's talk about this, guys, with the remaining time we have. Chuck, I'm going to hand it over to you first before we hand it over to John Q. Do you have anything to say?
Yeah. So I thought it was interesting how closely related the last three were with Mercury, Venus, and Saturn, and the fact that all of them, I think, portray more duality than any of the rest. Mercury, with its division and coming back together, I think is extremely pertinent both in our relationship to God and his relationship to himself, and how the spirits can all be separate parts of themselves, but also have the same mind, essentially. Not to like borrow from the Trinitarian theology or whatever, that there are three separate beings, but one mind, like that. I don't subscribe to that way of thinking, but I do think that the duality that's listed of him being a loving God that sacrifices and wants no one to perish, but also being the one that brings the sword. Like there's a extreme duality in those two parts, but they're both parts of the same being. So it does show us a little bit of the dichotomy in our own selves, and also in our relationship with God, that we separate sometimes from sin and then we come back together, whether it be willful sin or sin that we didn't catch and we have to repent for. That willful sin, he even provided a way for that separation and coming back together. If you're willing to go forth on the Day of Atonement and repent for it, like, so there's that status that's there. And then with Venus, like you said, the duality in those things, I think is very pertinent in the two sides to the same nature and how it can be perceived. And then again, with just the last one with Saturn and him being the picture of death and disaster. And I think the last battle is a perfect picture of what Armageddon was, because it is really depressing. Like, a lot of people died. There was a lot of martyrdom going on. There was a lot of world destruction happening, and everyone at the end of it was gone. But like, it wasn't the end. And we do have hope in that even through these apocalyptic times that we could be living in, a lot of the conversations we've had, even with John in that dialogue, apocalypses aren't the end. They're just the starts of new beginnings. So it's just an interesting way of looking at it. And I think Lewis captured it pretty well in the last battle. So that's what I had for it. And on to you, John, to trigger the world.
Yeah, thanks. So most of my sort of prep for this this get together was not necessarily on the seven firmaments, but most of my prep was on the second part of the title, which is the theology of C.S. Lewis. And being a Calvinist, I asked the question: was Lewis Reformed? Was he a Calvinist? And the answer that I found is not exactly and yes, of course. So we know Lewis was very secretive. I mean, he even kept his marriage secret for the better part of a year. So he didn't just come straight out and necessarily say, yes, I am this, or I hold to this doctrine. But you can definitely pick up on his theology in all of his writings, and it's a beautiful tapestry when you read Lewis. His positions weren't static. He developed his theology over his life. I wouldn't describe so they were changing, like, as anyone's positions do. His positions change as well, and I wouldn't describe him as someone who subscribed to as Douglas Wilson puts it, crawl over broken glass, jet fuel, black coffee Calvinism, or as Christopher Hitchens, a famous atheist, described it, weapons grade Calvinism. But I would say that C.S. Lewis was certainly Calvinistic in his theology. And so, step back. For those of you who might be listening who are not sure what Calvinism means, it really comes down to Calvinism versus Arminianism in your understanding of grace, the grace of God. Is salvation a cooperative affair? That would be the Arminian perspective. Or does Yahweh simply intervene to bless us by taking the initiative in our salvation? Another way to think of it was Lazarus raised from the dead in a semi-Pelagian fashion, with Lazarus pulling and Yahusha, or Lazarus pushing and Yahusha pulling, right? Or perhaps not. But at the end of the day, it's either the Calvinist tulip that you have to go with, or the Arminian daisy. And I don't know if anyone knows what the Arminian daisy is, but it's he loves me not, he loves me. Okay, all right. Bad Calvinist dad joke there. But listen to how Lewis describes his own conversion in Surprised by Joy. He says, quote, "In a sense, I was not moved by anything. I chose to open, to unbuckle, to loosen the rein." Now that sounds Arminian, okay, but he continues, "I say I chose, yet it did not really seem possible to do the opposite. On the other hand, I was aware of no motives. You could argue that I was not a free agent, but I was more inclined to think that this came nearer to being a perfectly free act than most that I had ever done. Necessity may not be the opposite of freedom." Now, this is key right here. Necessity may not be the opposite of freedom. And perhaps a man is more free when instead of producing motives, he can only say, "I am what I do." As Ransom discovered on Paralandra, freedom and necessity are actually the same thing. And what is our necessity? We have a necessity for salvation. Like, salvation is a necessity, right? He goes on to say, when we are most free, it is only with the freedom that God has given us. And when our will is most influenced by grace, it is still our will. All the initiative has been on God's side. All has been free, unbounded grace, and all will continue to be free, unbounded grace. Now, you can find things like Lewis said that he disbelieves the doctrine of total depravity, which is one of the the 5 parts of Calvinism. He said he disbelieves the doctrine of total depravity because if it were total, we should not know ourselves to be depraved, and partly because the experience shows us much goodness in human nature. Well, as a Calvinist, I would say, well, actually, we don't know we're depraved unless the Spirit shows us. And Lewis is actually rejecting, in this statement, he's actually rejecting the doctrine of absolute depravity, which Calvinists also reject. But if total depravity means a total inability, which I would argue it does, it would be the work of about 10 minutes to show that Lewis does in fact hold to that doctrine of total depravity. So let me conduct a brief tour of the Narnian tulip garden. And credit to finding the Narnian tulip garden goes to Douglas Wilson. I was prepping for this. I came across a talk that he gave on the theology of C.S. Lewis, and he walks through the Narnian tulip garden. So so for those of you who don't know what tulip is the sort of the 5 points of Calvinism. There's total depravity, or I would say total inability. There's unconditional election, that's the U. Limited atonement is the L. Irresistible grace is the I, and then perseverance of the saints is the P. So how does Narnia show us total depravity? Well, in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, Lewis understands the doctrine of total depravity, better described as total inability, very, very well. Eustace was a snotty brat of a boy who turned into a miserable dragon. Eustace discovered that he was utterly unable to heal himself. He was utterly unable to prepare himself to be healed. When he tried to remove the dragon skin by himself, all he was able to do was get down to the next layer of dragon skin. As long as Eustace was doing his own scraping, it would be dragon skins all the way down, right? Eustace was only undragoned once Aslan takes him and scrapes him down. And then Aslan takes him out of the dragon skin and throws him into the water, which is a baptism symbolism there. And Eustace is turned back into a boy again. So how does Narnia show unconditional election? Well, when Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy arrive in Narnia in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, they discover that there are 4 thrones sitting empty at Cair Paravel, and these thrones are waiting for them. So there's, that's also like a predestination thing there. Not only that, but there were
can I also?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was going to throw that one of the things that always really frustrated me about the Narnia books is because every child reads these and go, man, I want to go to Narnia, right? And nobody can just choose to go there. Like it would be one of those things like the wardrobe, for example. They would all go knock on the wardrobe and have a back. Nobody could go into it. They all thought it was a joke. And it would just happen. Like it would just, the professor said, you don't go looking for it. When it happens, it happens. And so that seems to kind of tie in with what you're saying, that it's in this case Aslan or Christ Messiah who decides when somebody is going to enter this journey or not, and there's nothing you can do about it. Am I correct? Yeah.
I mean, they were. Lewis describes them as being drawn into the ward. Like it's like they couldn't. No matter what they did, they were being chased. They were going to be in trouble if they were discovered for playing hide and seek, or by the lady of the house. And in a couple of them, Prince Caspian, they were there was nothing they could do about it. They were on the train station and they were just all pulled in. But even with the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, they're looking at the painting, and Eustace he was sick and he didn't want to go in, and he was pushed in too. So they had just no choice in it at all. Absolutely. Yeah. So not only were there 4 empty thrones waiting for them, there were prophecies about them, which is why the White Witch wants to kill Edmund. One of the reasons, because that would thwart the prophecy. But it's clear in the Narnian books that a prophecy from Aslan cannot be thwarted. And then in the Silver Chair, when Jill tried to explain to Aslan that they had called on him, on Aslan, that they had asked him to bring them into Narnia, Aslan replies with that if he had not called them, they would not have called him, which that just immediately makes me think of 1 John 4:19. We loved him because he first loved us. Limited atonement. When Aslan is killed on the stone table, it's for one person, Edmund the traitor. It's not for everybody. It's for one. It's limited atonement right there. The great lion gave his life for one grimy little boy who, remember, had a throne waiting for him. It's seen as a very definite atonement.
By the way, not that this goes a little bit off from what you're talking about, but in the idea of limited atonement and the fact that he does die just for Edmund and not for the other three, that ties in with a lot of medieval thinking as well. With Adam, they were really big on Adam, and you read like when you read First Adam and Eve and other books like that, it's all about where Yah says, "I am coming to redeem you. I'm coming to get you." And he went down to Sheol just to get Adam. Now he pulled out others with him, but he went there to fulfill his promise, not to everybody else, but just Adam. So just there kind of ties in with the idea that, obviously there were other people, but he specifically wanted one guy.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great point. Irresistible grace. This is one of my favorite. I might choke up because I'm choking up right now, and I choked up when I was discovering this. In the silver chair, when Jill encounters Aslan in his high country, Aslan is between her and the stream, and the stream is symbolizes living water, and she's dying of thirst. She's nearly frantic to take a drink. She's frantic for the living water, right? The lion invites her to drink, but Aslan is in between her and the stream. He's in between her and the stream. Well, she tries to make a deal with him. She asks if he could go away for a while she drinks. In other words, can I have the gift but not the giver? She is answered with a very low growl. She asks if he will promise not to do anything to her if she does come. I make no promise, Aslan said. She then asks if he eats little girls. I have swallowed up girls and boys, kings and empires, cities and realms, says the lion. She says she doesn't dare come to drink. Then you will die of thirst, said the lion. Now, notice how Lewis resolves this whole scene. He says, then her mind suddenly made itself up. Not an accident, freedom and necessity are the same thing. Perseverance of the saints. This is a P in tulip. What about Susan, the detractors would say, right? She was missing in the last battle. She was too old for those silly games they used to play as a child. She no longer believes in Narnia. Well, Susan was not killed in the railway accident. She was not there. And I would say we should not speculate about her final destiny unless we want Aslan to growl at us for impudent guesswork about someone else's story. Everyone is on their own journey, and each story is different. Is a different thread of the same epic tale that is being weaved together by the writer of all writers. And they will all come together in the end. All of our stories are all going to come together in an end in one cohesive, mind-blowing eschaton. It's going to be, it's trust me, we're going to have our minds blown to have all of our stories, not only ours, but people that we don't know, people that we've never met, and all of our ancestors and all of their ancestors, everyone in the world and their actions and actions that they took and how it affected the ripple effects, how it affects us and things that we do and who we are. Besides, if anyone wants to argue that the ultimate Cair Paravel in the center of the ultimate Narnia, where the further up and the further in you go, the bigger it gets. If anyone wants to argue that Cair Paravel only has 3 thrones in it, well, I wish them good luck. To quote the professor, well, bless me, it is all in the institutes. What do they teach them in these schools? So I'll end the tour of the Narnian Tulip Garden with this quote from C.S. Lewis. The doctrine of predestination is full of sweet, pleasant, and unspeakable comfort to godly persons. So was C.S. Lewis a Calvinist? Not exactly. And yes, of course.
I want to touch really quickly one more time on that point about the 4 chairs in the true, the true heaven, right? And that's obviously a play on the last battle where, well, talk about that in a second. So what is your thoughts on that? Because, you obviously Susan didn't make it. Now, Susan gets a lot of criticism out there from people. They're like, that's so stupid that like someone would go to Narnia and don't believe in him. Actually, no, this is coming from the mind of an atheist, a former atheist.
Yeah.
This is a guy who understood this very well because he was there. This is a guy who's like, he knows what it is to read the Bible and not believe it and be like, this is the dumbest thing ever, to the Bible becomes alive to him. And this is where, like, in his theology, he's like, fine, maybe I can't even explain the atonement. As an atheist, I couldn't either. But you know what? It's real and it's alive, and we could experience this atonement, right? And I personally, I'm middle-aged now. I have personally been in the ministry with people, not just seeing people from afar, but close to me, who were passionate about the faith. The Bible was the most true thing for them, and I watched as they grew up, so to speak. In Narnia it's makeup, but in this, it was they fell into worldliness. They became proud, and one day they woke up and they looked at the Bible to say this is Narnia for them, that the experience they had of this other world, the spiritual reality, and they were like, I can't believe I ever believed that before. It's dead to me. And they just walked away, and it was just darkness. And that is exactly what can happen to all of us, and why it's so important to guard the commands. But yeah, I want to hear a little bit more about your idea on the 4 chairs. Like, who's sitting in it? Are you insinuating that Susan does sit in it, or what's your thoughts?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. I would say that at the end of the book, she wasn't in her chair yet, but her story wasn't completed. She didn't die on that train. Her story wasn't finished. And it's very likely that Lewis leaves that to the reader's imagination. How is Aslan going to resolve that situation? He doesn't leave it unresolved. He doesn't resolve it at all. It's unresolved. And that throne was meant for her. So I would say, for me, I would say he that started a good work in us is faithful and just to carry it to completion. So I kind of, for me personally, I imagine that train accident that kills her siblings, Yah uses to draw her back to him. That's how I picture it. And I see when she does pass from this world to the next, that she ends up on that throne. Yeah.
I actually have never once heard that in my life, John Q. That was the first. That was actually very, very insightful, because it's true. Because even though Narnia came to an end, they were from London, of course. They were from England, and that did not come to an end. So even though Susan, her reality was like, it's kind of interesting, because her reality is like, okay, I don't believe in Narnia anymore. My 3 siblings still do. I'm not interested in that. Then she lives in a world where her 3 siblings die. And not only that, but the professor and Polly, who were friends with the children, they die, and her cousin Eustace and Jill, the friend of Eustace, they die. They all die, and she's like, "What in the world just happened?" And now she has to continue inhabiting this world, which she thinks is the only real world. So yeah, it's true. Her story did not come to. Oh, their parents too. Their parents died. I think they died too. They all died. Just Susan lives. And what a tragic story for her to have to reconcile that. And she had a lot to think through. I will touch on one thing that I found. Now, there were so many things, Lewis. We have this discussion. John Q, I could have you on we could just talk about Tolkien.
On that note, Noel, what you just said is pretty profound too, because we already talked about how in the case of Saturn, the death doesn't necessarily represent a bad thing. She's the only one who hasn't died and gone on to be with him. And she also is the only one that didn't sit on the throne. Like, there's a correlation there. Like, she hasn't received the reward yet of, like, technically you could look at it in the case of martyrdom. They got the reward earlier because they were obedient and did what they were told, and she still has to struggle through life because she hasn't received the blessing yet, like, of getting to sit on that throne. So that's in there too.
Yeah, C.S. Lewis was very much against the. There's so much we could talk about on Lewis. I mean, he was very much against the Protestant idea. His specific words, if I can phrase it right, was that he criticized Protestant idea of the afterlife, that Protestants believe that where a tree falls, or a tree lies where it falls. So basically, like, like whether you make a decision in your life, either you believe or you don't, and then you die, and then you become this robot and you're the super spiritual angel up in heaven. But if you don't, you go to hell. And his view was that the pursuit of holiness does not end at death. And it goes on and on and on. And we still have free will, and we have to make this decision. This goes into the last battle, the whole further up and further in. And I think Lewis is spot on. I've been thinking about this my whole life. This idea where he describes heaven as an onion that as you unpeel it, the peels get bigger and bigger and bigger. So this idea is when you first enter heaven, it's this tiny little world. It feels huge, but it's this tiny little world. But as you choose to inhabit and live in heaven more, this gnosis is created within you, where it keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and it goes on for eternity. It just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and it's absolutely brilliant. And one of the things I used to criticize as well was I was kind of dumb when I became an adult and I'm reading The Last Battle, and they talk about how Aslan tells the children that in this heaven, so there's like Aslan's country that connects to all the worlds, which again is brilliant, because I think that's what heaven is. But they can look down and they can see London, and they can go to London. Like, what do you mean there's London in heaven? That's the dumbest thing. But John Q, we could like do a whole thing just talking about Tolkien and like all the things that Lewis and Tolkien knew. I mean, they knew stuff.
Oh yeah.
And they're talking about the millennial kingdom having happened from my view is from 500 to 1500, the dark ages, the 1,000 years that was the millennial kingdom on the earth. And you have, he's teaching at a city like Oxford. Oxford is one of the most beautiful cities on earth. It is a millennial kingdom. It is a medieval city, millennial kingdom city. I believe it was built by the righteous saints. And this idea that these cities actually, like the true form of these cities actually exist into eternity. Like it's in a Platonic sense that this is a copy of something that exists higher up. I mean, there's just so much there. It's brilliant. The older I get and the more I reflect on Lewis, I went through this thing, like I loved Lewis's books as a kid. And then I became an adult. I was kind of like, not like Susan, because I've always believed the Bible is true, but I became too logical for Lewis. Right. And I kind of steered away, and I'm just coming back to like almost everything he's talking about. I'm like, because I'm reading these ancient books, and I'm like, oh, Lewis was just reading the same books. He was just reading the books that I'm reading, and I agree with these books, and now I agree with him again. So, okay, well, I think that we should. What's sad is that we didn't really get this conversation going for the last 20 minutes or so. Because I had to get through all that reading. I hope everyone enjoyed this, and we definitely need to do this again. I need to get the whole gang together. I need to get Matthew and Graham. I need to get you guys all in here to do another Donald J. Trump video and talk about all things politics. But yeah, I hope this was informative for everyone out there. Maybe I made some good sales for Michael Ward. I probably will make better sales for Michael Ward than for my own books. And of course, John Q is an author. Great, Chuck. Maybe you can write a book for us someday, and you could be.
I've got a bunch of short stories I've written. I just don't have them in any particular format. So
see, then we need to format those and get them out there. So I enjoyed this discussion, and I'd like to have more of these, just these roundtable discussions on different topics, and it was good. So. I think we'll end here. Was there anything else you wanted to say? Either one of you, speak now, forever hold your peace, or until the next time we get together.
No, just thanks for having me on, Noel. And Chuck, is good hanging out with you again and discussing these kind of topics. I always enjoy it.
Absolutely, brother. It's been great hanging out with both of you tonight. And again, just appreciate the opportunity to come on and have a good conversation.
Let me just say one more thing on a closing thought. Speaking about esoteric things, because what we talked about today was very esoteric, right? We were talking about things that many things that up until recently I didn't see it, and now I can't unsee it. I really like esoteric material, and I have found. I did a whole thing on Winnie the Pooh. I did a whole thing like just showing like I just took the first 5 chapters of Pooh. There's like multiple books by A.E. Malignani on it, but I've shown that there's something about when the very successful writers, the very successful ones, they write a story to an exoteric audience, meaning just surface. They're writing a story that the surface level people, they just see skin deep stuff in there. And they don't tell you about the deeper embedded stuff. But if you have, like, this is the success of Star Wars or whatever. I mean, the original trilogy is very esoteric. The original Indiana Jones films are all very esoteric. You can just dig and dig and dig into these. And most people will never see it. But there's something about the deeper spiritual implications in there that it affects people in ways that they don't realize. There's something to it. And I'll just kind of leave on that note. So good night, everybody.
Anytime you want to have an esoteric Star Wars discussion, I'm in, Noel.
Really? Because I could do a whole thing. I'd love to do a whole thing on Tartaria and the Millennial Kingdom and Star Wars sometime.
Yeah, that would be fascinating. I'm into all of those topics. So anytime you want to do it, we can set that up.
Okay, I think I need to get some guys to go. We'll just have a nerd night. We'll just talk about Star Wars and the Bible.
We need to create our own, Lewis and Tolkien club. You know what I mean? Like what they did. We need to create our own. Yeah.
Our own Inkling group. Yeah, we could call ourselves the Fellowship of the Flat Earth. So we could all be members of the Fellowship of the Flat Earth. So, all right. Good night, everybody.
Hey, Polyhart here. Was calling my dad this morning, wishing him a Happy New Year, and he said, "Hey, Happy New Year back, son." And he was listening to Alexander Scornaby read the book of Ezekiel on audiobook, and I was like, that's awesome. I love listening to good translations, but the thing is, with a lot of times when I go to research biblical translations, I want to look up a passage, I want to see what the original Hebrew says, and I want to see what the real meaning is behind it, and I can't find a lot of good translations out there. I go to BibleHub.com, 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 and I go there and I'll look at each word and find out what the best solution is to this verse. If I want to try to look at something in the context of something else, really interesting stuff. My friend Pamela Glasgow is translating the entire Bible into the Paleo Hebrew, the first written language of the Hebrews. It was Paleo. It was like a pictorial language. It's not only spelt and built, it's a unique pictorial language, kind of like the Chinese or Japanese or Korean is a pictorial language as well as a said language and a spelt language. When you add a different thing to the end, it creates the entire idea from the beginning, makes it a new idea. So Paleo Hebrew, really impactful, and we are raising money for her to do that for a full-time job / business / career / ministry. And Noel Hadley with the unexpectedcosmology.com is leading the charge on getting her translations out to the world. So below, I'm going to list a link on how you can give to see the Paleo Hebrew Bible come to its full fruition. Also, she's got some of the Bible, I believe all the Torah, and some of the Psalms are being done now. It's a continual work, but I'm excited. It's going to be spectacular. So how you can help this come to pass is by your financial gift, your giving to Pamela, so that she can continue on in the calling of her life, which it's going to be awesome. One day I want to go to BibleHub.com and see the Paleo Hebrew as well, which would be mind-blowing. So you have a good day, and I'll see you later. Bye.